Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. With the chestnut harvest season approaching, we have our annual chestnut-themed episode today with a true living legend in the field of tree crops research, Dick Jaynes. On today's episode, we discuss Dick's decades of research on hybrid chestnuts, specific cultivars that emerged from his breeding work, limitations to commercial chestnut growing, nut tree culture in North America, the handbook he published with the Northern Nut Growers Association, and a variety of other related topics. Stick with us. Okay, so do you want me to call you Dick Jaynes?
Yeah, that's fine.
All your published work says Richard A. Jaynes. So
yeah, of course. No, I'm known as Dick.
So why don't we give our listeners a little bit of background of who you are, where you grew up, your early education or interests, and how that led to the chestnut work and the work at the Agricultural Experiment Station here in Hamden, Connecticut, where we're recording with the beautiful view of Sleeping Giant in the distance. And also sort of an explanation of what the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station is and Lockwood Farm and the Graves Plantation.
Well, going way back in my background, my dad was actually an entomologist, and I never thought I had any interest in insects or anything, but it was only later on I realized, well, hey, he was a insect scientist, and my leanings were towards plants. But I guess my interest in plants, growing up as a young kid, we always had a vegetable garden. And then when I was in 5th grade, we moved from New Jersey, Chatham, New Jersey, up to Hamden, Connecticut. And my dad had a small apple orchard. It took up about 5 acres. We had maybe 8 acres all together. And I was in 4-H. In 1947, we planted some Christmas trees around what we consider the wasteland around the apple orchard. Well, they did pretty well, and we got some more seedlings in, maybe the next year or 2 years later. We started cutting down apple trees to make room for more Christmas trees. So pretty soon the apple trees were gone and we were into the Christmas tree business. It's only in hindsight that I realized that it was pretty much a lousy site. Some of the lowland was a floodplain from a small brook that went through there. It was a frost pocket, cold air drained down from the hillsides nearby. So we couldn't grow any true firs. We were pretty much confined to spruce, blue spruce, Norway spruce, white spruce. I married a local girl, Sally, and we purchased land here where we are now, 13 Broken Arrow Road, the same town that my folks had moved up to. And so I've been growing Christmas trees for more than 75 years, a kid with my dad. He was doing all the work then, of course, but it was my project, so he said. So that gave me a definite, well, plus I really liked the apple trees, pruning them and harvesting them. They were Macintosh. And, back in those days, the apples that fell on the ground, we'd pick up, put in boxes, my dad would take to a local cider mill. So I went to Wesleyan, liberal arts school, and the only plant science course I had there was 1 semester of botany. And so why did I go to Wesleyan? I don't know. It gave me a pretty good education and helped me become a little bit better writer, because that was not my forte in high school, writing or spelling. In fact, one of the gifts I got from Arthur Graves was a dictionary. This was long before spell check. So, realized I had to go on to graduate school to specialize in something. And Vince Cochran, my botany teacher, in one semester, I guess I also had a semester of mycology with him. I said, well, I'm thinking of forestry school or horticulture. He says, well, forestry is an applied science. That's fine if you definitely want to go into forestry. But otherwise, he suggested I go to botany. He said, you can always go to horticulture and applied science from there. And I had worked a couple of summers on the farm crew at the Connecticut Experiment Station, hoeing weeds out in the corn and stuff. Then I'd gone to Minnesota for 2 summers to work on spruce budworm insect out there. Ely, Minnesota, the gateway to the wilderness. And that was, first time away from home, and it's kind of exciting. Came back and worked another summer or two at the experiment station in the genetics department, making crosses on chestnut and corn for Donald Jones, who was a famous corn breeder there. I was coming up to graduate from Wesleyan, and Dr. Jones or others in the genetics department said, you can come do your research here at the experiment station if you can get into Yale and the botany department, which is what I did. That was great because at times, of course, myself included, people didn't know where I was because I was enrolled in the botany department, taking some forestry courses, but doing all my research at the ag station. It worked out, and 4 years later, with some struggling, of course, I did get a PhD and was offered a position at the experiment station.
And what year was that?
1961.
Gotcha.
Just a couple of years ago. And they said they wanted me to continue on chestnut, but to pick up another project. And they were pretty open as to what that might be. I thought about rhododendrons, azaleas. So much work had been done on them by amateurs and even other scientists. Looked at Andromeda pieris, holly. I decided from weeding in holly, I really didn't want those prickly things around me. But no, it was a legitimate option. But Elwyn Orton at New Jersey was doing some good work with them. A graduate student in the forestry school did a dissertation on native mountain laurel. And I said, whoa, state flower. There's only 7 species in the genus. I can handle that. There's 1,000 species of rhododendron and azaleas. So I decided to work on mountain laurel. And that's another whole long story. But it was very gratifying work. The generation time it's not an easy plant, but compared to chestnut, it was easy. Generation time is shorter. So my dissertation was on chestnut, cytology and genetics of Castanea. I did chromosome counts, for one thing, on the different species, and quickly learned that I definitely did not wish to be a cytologist. I think for each chromosome count that I might have succeeded in doing, I ended up with a migraine headache from looking through a microscope. But anyway, because Arthur Graves, Hans Nietz had made many crosses of chestnut, and these offspring were at Sleeping Giant Plantation or at the Lockwood Farm or the experiment station, there was a lot of material to look at, and I made additional interspecific crosses. Long and the short of it was, we confirmed that the species were quite compatible with each other, with rare exceptions.
And so at that time, the work had already been done, or not the work that you're talking about specifically, but chestnut work had been done by Arthur Graves for...
Yeah, he started 1930. He was at I believe, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and some of his first crosses were with the Japanese chestnut, which had probably been brought in the late 1800s from Japan, and may have been the way chestnut blight got into this country. He crossed the American chestnut with the Japanese, so-called JA hybrids. That was 1930 and back about that time. But then he began to have access to Chinese chestnuts, which are reasonably resistant to chestnut blight. And so he crossed these JA with C, but shorthand became known as CJAs, a 3-way cross, half Chinese, a quarter Japanese, quarter American. The problem was most of them did not have particularly vigorous upright growth and had more characteristics of the Asiatic species than the American. But then, we went on and made second generation complex crosses using some of those parents. And so Arthur Graves, I got to know him a little bit when I was making crosses there under Hans Nienstedt. He was a wonderful gentleman. He was a taxonomist by training and did a great book on trees and shrubs for the Northeast in particular. I regret to this day, the book he gave me I loaned out and never came back. So I don't even have a copy anymore. Anyway, great guy, always well-dressed, was fairly tall, just a real gentleman, but dedicated to chestnut. He apparently, in the 1920s or so, it's hard to picture him on a motorcycle surveying damage to the American chestnut from the chestnut blight. But so that got him involved in chestnut and thinking about it. And so he started making crosses. And he was never hired by the experiment station, but always had a close liaison with the people. Donald Jones, who's head of the genetics department.
And so the Arthur Graves plantation at Sleeping Giant, then, was that private land?
Yes. He and a fellow graduate student way back in the 19-teens, had purchased that land. And then Arthur had bought it. He had a summer place there. And he eventually gave it to the state as part of Sleeping Giant, with the understanding as long as chestnut research was done, it wouldn't become an integral part of the park as long as the chestnut work was going on.
I see. Yeah, that landscape is beautiful today to go to and just see like this forest of mature chestnut trees,
yes.
CGAs, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And some of the original trees that now are in cultivation and are grown in Missouri and all over the place are the seedlings and the progeny of those original trees. Okay, so let's talk about your dissertation research in terms of the crosses. I have a pretty interesting. Where is it? Yeah, I think this is something that you published, and showing the cross. Yeah, isn't that?
Oh yeah, that looks like graduate work.
Which is pretty wild. I mean, so we're looking at a diagram that shows every species of chestnut with lines drawn in this crazy octagon crossing over them, from Ozark chinkapin crossing over to Japanese chestnut, and every species of chinkapin. I'm assuming what this shows is essentially that these different species are cross-compatible and can make progeny.
Exactly, and that's the results of crosses that I made, but also crosses that Graves and Hans Nienstedt in particular made. Yep, that was part of the dissertation.
And so before this, had anybody known that these sort of crosses could be made in this sort of detail? I mean, it seems like...
No, what I was able to do is pull together the work that had been done by predecessors there at the experiment station, and maybe a little bit from what was in the literature, and then actual crosses that I made.
At the Arthur Graves plantation, which I visit during harvest season, which I think is allowed.
Oh yeah, why not? It's public land.
Some of the nuts that are there are incredibly sweet. You know, I've had chestnuts before that are more like bready, I would describe them, and then I've had ones that are like, wow, that tastes like candy. And some of the ones some of those that are on the candy side, I've harvested from the Arthur Graves plantation. And also, there's ones there that have one nut per burr, which would mean that they have the chinkapin genetics.
Right.
I wonder if the sweet nuts that I've gotten are the chinkapin hybrids, and if they've gotten that sweetness from the chinkapins. Do you think that's the
that
case?
Could be. I guess I never got that many chinkapin nuts that I bothered eating. They're pretty small to peel. But yeah, fine. They have good taste, and they're crunchy like a nut when they're fresh. Or ideally, you don't want to eat them the day you pick them up off the ground, you know, when they just dropped out of the burr. A week or two later, when they've some of the bitterness seems to disappear and the sweetness becomes more prominent. From my point of view, the American chestnut is the best tasting nut. Again, they're not very large, but bigger than chinkapins. And they're among the easiest to peel. The indimentum, that fuzzy coat over the kernel, that comes off very readily on American chestnuts. Not quite so easy, but reasonably well on a Chinese chestnut. And then the Japanese and European chestnut, especially as you get into the large nut selections, it's really difficult to get that indimentum off. And those nuts they're worthless fresh. I mean, European chestnut, I don't think any Europeans eat them raw. They got to be cooked and in whatever way you want to do it, roasted. But the American chestnut is a fine raw nut.
And so initially, when you were doing the research from the literature I've looked at, it looked like you were identifying like for 4 different characteristics, either timber or nut production or ornamental qualities, like as potential for somebody to have a yard tree.
Yeah.
And the last one, as a source for food for wildlife. That's the other one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the most valuable attributes of the American chestnut. And all chestnuts tend to bear fruit annually, which is different than most nut trees, mass trees. Have a heavy crop and then they may go 2 or 3 years with none or very light, which is tough on wildlife that's trying to fatten themselves up annually, turkeys and other wildlife.
Pheasants and foxes and deer.
Yep.
So from all of the crosses that you did and all of the hybrid chestnut work, was there any of the hybrids that stood out to you as things that, so like the American chestnut maybe tasted the best in there, and I know you were selecting for some timber form trees and some nut producing trees. To me, the CJAs, I have a lot of interest because I'm interested in more of the orchard setting.
Right.
And specifically that sleeping giant tree, produces huge nuts every year and is really valued in the commercial nut industry today.
Sure. And in some respects, I'm not sure it's all that different from some of the better Chinese selections, like the Eaton. And I believe the Eaton came about because Arthur Graves gave a few seedlings to Mr. Eaton. And Arthur probably told me about the trees, but anyway, checked them out a few years in succession. And it's like, wow, this is one great nut, as large as any that, well-formed tree that seemed blight resistant. So, yeah, I was delighted with that as a nut tree selection.
Actually, I have the story here. Somewhere it's written down. Specifically, it was in Wallingford, Connecticut.
Yes. And not too far, actually, from Sleeping Giant, but in Wallingford. I think it was in Wallingford.
So that was something that Arthur Graves did before you were...
Well, it was a seedling. I mean, like myself, I gave away lots of seedlings, often from just open pollinated grown things, but normally we tried to select, big nuts like from Sleeping Giant or things like that. And yes, I think he and I, in different ways, tried to be Johnny Appleseed-like and giving away, here, try this Chinese chestnut seedling or this hybrid seedling, see how you do. Mostly for people who I think I anticipated they were going to be growing them as nut trees and not looking or expecting to get a forest tree in their backyard.
And did you do that as part of the Connecticut Nut Growers Association, or was it...
Oh, partly, sure. Bring plants to a meeting or for a plant sale so they could get some money to do whatever. We had a pretty active Connecticut Nut Growers group, and of course shortly after I started working full-time at the experiment station, although before that, probably through Arthur Graves, he got me involved with the nut growers. He said, oh yeah, he'd publish articles once in a while in the Northern Nut Growers. And anyway, so pretty soon I started going to their annual meetings, which were held mostly anywhere from the Midwest throughout the East. And because I was working on chestnut, a nut tree, it was a group I felt comfortable with. I think sometimes the administration was wondering what I was doing with a bunch of mostly amateur nut tree growers. But anyway, I think once we published the first edition of the Nut Tree Handbook, they maybe felt a little bit better about what I was doing. We were at the experiment station basically in a publish or perish situation. We had to publish not just popular, but occasional some scientific papers like chromosome counts or interspecific crosses, things that the average person might not see much value in immediately, but hopefully would have some long-term value.
Why don't we talk about the handbook that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. Actually, there are two editions,
1979 for
yeah, 69 and 79. They're basically 10 years apart. Well, when I got involved in the nut growers, George Slate, who is a fruit breeder, Heritage Raspberry, I think, was one of his introductions. And L.H. McDaniels, I think he'd been head of the horticultural department, but he'd been retired. He joked about, the retirement system in New York was going to go bust with me because he lived like 40 years beyond his retirement age. He was a wonderful guy, but very dedicated, like George Slate, to nut trees. And as one of the kind of new guys on the block, George had been editor of the annual report of the nut growers, and I think he probably got me involved with being the editor, and I did that, I think, for 19 years. We published a book from reports that were given at the annual meeting, and it was often 150 pages or so. It was kind of fun working with amateurs as well as other scientists, and getting some pretty rough manuscripts and trying to make them so the information got across. But anyway, so George and L.H. McDaniels, I'm sure they've been talking for years that they had to do a nut tree book. And they pointed their finger at me. After they'd worked on me for a year or so, I said, sure, but you each have to do at least one chapter in the book. I contributed a couple of chapters myself, but basically I was the editor and got, 25, 30 nut tree people from across the country to contribute to it. And I learned, never having done that sort of thing before, it's a little bit like herding cats. The authors that were difficult to get manuscripts out of the first time, 10 years later, the same people, same characteristics. I figured, they just got to edit what they gave me 10 years ago, and not easy. But on the other hand, I kind of enjoyed it. I mean, dealing with those people, all good people.
And so everybody wrote a chapter basically on a different nut tree, and you wrote a chapter on chestnuts? Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, propagation, wildlife, all the time. And I even had a guy here who was a wood craftsman, did cutting boards and other things. I had him do an article on crafts, whatever. And so it, and as I say, many of the authors were just dedicated amateurs who knew more about hickories or hardy Persian walnuts than any, quote, scientist. So, that first edition, Spencer Chase was the executive secretary of the nut growers. He'd been executive secretary for a long time. We're doing this nut tree book, and it came up time to publish it. I talked to Spencer about what we're going to do, and our annual reports had always been done by Humphrey Press, I think right in Geneva, New York. And so we got a price from them. Well, it's going to be $15,000 to publish this thing, maybe do 3,000 copies. And it's like, okay, we get $5,000 in the treasury. People like George Slate and L.H. McDaniels said, well, they'd buy like 10 copies of the book, prepay, basically, and whether they resold or gave the books away, who knows? I'm sure they gave them away. Well, that still left us short. So I went to the experiment station director, Jim Horsfall, and I said, we got a problem to publish this book. from the Lockwood Trust, not state funds, but they had a independent trust fund. I said, could we borrow? Now, it may have been 5,000. It was at least 3,000. He agreed. And honestly, I don't think he thought there was a snowball's chance in hell that they'd get that money back. I was so delighted a year later to walk in with a check. The book had sold so well, and Spencer's wife had distributed it. So there was minimal cost in distributing it. And then on the second edition, my wife actually did the distribution. And we accumulated money to, when the association first started making small grants to researchers.
And at that time, do you think that there was a large interest amongst homeowners in planting nut trees? And around that time was the time that my own grandfather planted a Carpathian walnut, or 2 Carpathian walnuts, in his backyard.
I think there was some interest. And I mean, sort of, you're recalling George Slate and L.H. McDaniels, between the two of them, they almost always, every year, had a popular article on nut trees in Horticultural Magazine, or, magazines that went to plant people who might be interested in having a nut tree in their backyard of whatever kind. And the really, really interested people, what they obviously hoped, they would join the Northern Nut Growers as a member. So, I'm not sure there was any great groundswell, but those guys certainly helped keep interest across the country among gardeners. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that you had an impact as well. Just driving up the road to come to... right now we're recording at Broken Arrow Nursery in Hamden, Connecticut. Driving up the road, I saw 2, and I've seen these trees before, and I've always remarked that, there's 2 Chinese chestnuts planted right next to each other in someone's front yard.
Yeah, on Todd Street.
Yeah. And so is that somebody that you knew?
We know them, but I honestly don't know where those trees came from.
Huh.
Yeah, whether they came through the experiment station or whatever. Our state nursery, years ago, we would give them a couple thousand nuts from different trees, and they would sow them and distribute them along with other ornamental and Christmas tree seedlings. I mean, you could purchase them for a very small price.
I saw that in the back of one of these annual reports. It says that you can contact Hartford DP or someone.
Yeah.
Why did they stop doing that? I'd love to be able to purchase seedlings from the experiment station.
A new state forester decided that for some reason, whether they didn't want to compete with private individuals, it's not that what they were doing was costing the state any money, because the money they got back in paid for the upkeep and the maintenance and the employees that were working on producing the seedlings. But anyway, they used to have, what did they call them? Conservation pack or something. You might get a nut tree,
Christmas tree or something.
Christmas tree seedling and some other fruit trees, shadblow or something like that,
Seems like a great idea. I don't know why we would stop doing that. Very interesting. Okay. So we talked about Eaton a little bit, which, I think is really, the story of that, I think, is actually in the handbook. I assume this was written by you. Because it's Eaton. The Eaton chestnut is an orchard or ornamental tree selected for its handsome glossy foliage. The original tree was one of several seedlings given to Frederick S. Eaton of Wallingford, Connecticut by Arthur H. Graves. It was named for Mr. Eaton by R.A. Jaynes in 1970. Although the parentage is unknown, it is suspected to be a seedling of sleeping giant, a Chinese by Japanese American hybrid. In general, the tree characteristics are those of Chinese chestnut. And now this is, I think it's crazy that the story of this tree, this is one of the most popular cultivars out there. Eaton is all over the country, and that story is so cool. Are the trees still there in Wallingford?
I might have to check with Sandy. I think she would know better than I. I've been by there, and I'm like, it's been so long, and there's still some trees there. I'm not 100% certain. I'd have to go when they were fruiting to identify it. And I think it's still there.
Because that was on just in somebody's backyard, basically.
Front yard, actually. Wow. Yeah, steep slope down to the road.
Interesting. It's just crazy to me to think that one of the most popular commercial cultivars of chestnuts has a story where it just came from somebody's front yard. And
well, that's why you play the role of Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah, every seedling is a journey.
Yep, going back a little bit, we got a grant at the experiment station from Mrs. Volk, Ann Volk, and we called it the Village Smithy Fund. Long story short, it allowed us to do a cooperative chestnut planting down in Virginia. Tom Deeroff was the forester for most of the time that we were involved in planting down there. And we were able to plant some controlled crosses down there, but honestly we did a lot of open pollinated seed from trees like clapper, which is an American hybrid chestnut with pretty good form, but not totally resistant to blight. But that was, we planted thousands of trees down there. They're still there. Probably some pretty nice ones, but I haven't had the opportunity to go back and look at them.
It's just incredible to think of, your work has spread its way out so far across the United States. Okay, so the other tree, this tree is really special to me. I just think it's really cool how a cultivar of chestnut that is all over the place and is named after a mountain range that I climbed as a child and spent a lot of time climbing up to the little observation tower and that sort of thing. So Sleeping Giant, which is a hybrid and was released by Arthur Graves from the experiment station in 1960. This tree is one that I think is kind of one of the standouts from the Arthur Graves plot. Do you like it? Do you like the nuts from it?
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a good one. Yeah. Most of the initial input of that cross was, of course, to get more of a timber type tree, but hey, there's a good nut tree.
It's also a beautiful tree. I love its habit.
Yes.
I also think that the Sleeping Giant tree is just a fantastic, beautiful tree for public landscapes or for, its ornamental characteristics, which was one of the original things that you were selecting for and looking for. And personally, I think that chestnuts in the public realm, there are people who want to harvest chestnuts. They're becoming more and more popular. But there are some concerns about like the burrs in landscapes. How do you feel about was that something you ever thought about with these trees with suggesting them for homeowners? Did people come to you and say, "Hey, my dog stepped on the burr"? And when I went to the agricultural experiment station recently for a tour, one of the people who works there said, "Oh yeah, chestnuts in public landscapes, they can, your dogs can pick them up, and the burrs are spiny." And so. And I said, I never thought about that,
I'll be honest, I haven't thought about it much either, but I can remember the S8 Jap tree in what we call the West Lot. I can remember a young kid, he couldn't have been more than 4, running over there in the fall barefoot.
Oh, no.
And got at the base of the tree, and the ground was just covered with burrs. I had to carry him out of there.
Oh, no.
But anyway, these days, it might be a concern, I guess, with dogs and
liability and people.
Yeah, it's. I've thought about this about other things, and it's like things are. Oh, well, the ladders we used to use, A ladders, so A frame, 12 feet high. And then I think a 10-foot ladder up the middle that you could raise up. And we'd climb up that and sit on the top of it. Well, most of the land is sloping over there. But so you had to be very careful to orient the thing up and down the hill. And if it was too steep, you might tip over sort of backwards, you might say. But anyway, we never had a problem. I think those ladders went on the brush fire years and years ago, and they do everything from a bucket now, hydraulic bucket.
Certain friends of mine will just climb the tree and just knock them down, or just...
Oh, knock them down. Yeah, I was thinking about hand pollinating, making crosses with putting bags on the tree and all that good stuff.
Right, yeah. Which I'm sure you did quite a bit of.
Oh, yeah. As a summer worker and also as a researcher, yeah. Yeah, some people don't like the odor of chestnut when it's in bloom. And hey, we used to put the catkins in our mouth, and it's like, never really bothered me.
Yeah, I don't think they have a offending odor either. Some people, I guess, think they smell like sweat.
Donald Jones had house neighborhood with small lots, but he always had a chestnut or two there. And his wife would say, "Donald, chestnut's blooming. You've got to cut that down." She hated the odor of the chestnut in bloom.
What about grafted chestnuts versus seedling chestnuts? I've heard stories of delayed graft failure sometimes with grafted trees, and just in general, the something that you write about in the book, the Nut Tree Culture in North America book, is the need for grafting for uniformity for commercial use.
Yeah.
But now there's tons of people who are planting trees just as seedlings all over the place, for better or for worse. Is that why do you think it is that the grafted chestnuts in the Northeast have this tendency to fail years later?
There definitely is some incompatibility. As a general rule, American chestnut and Chinese seem to be incompatible. If you stick within a species, you're better off, but you can even have trouble then. The additional problem, of course, is you've got a wound when you do a graft. And if there's chestnut blight around, and whether the trees are resistant, or it can mess it up. They're at a precarious stage in their knitting and becoming a successful plant. But speaking of that, in 1958, I was still a graduate student. I went down to see Flippo Gravitt, who was a plant pathologist who'd worked on chestnut quite a bit. And I think he was about to retire. So they wanted me to come down and pick up some of their reprints that maybe I would distribute. And anyway, he took me out to an area called Scientist Cliffs. He was developing for scientists like himself to retire there. And they have a bunch of nerds living together. And I think that to some degree that actually happened. But anyway, he took me out and showed me American chestnut, a small grove, that were at least 75 feet tall and maybe 30 inches in diameter. And so I brought back some scion and grafted it. And there's one tree at the Lockwood Farm that's still there, and it's huge. It's not pretty. It's had blight, but it's on a Chinese chestnut seedling. It sprouted once or twice, and it's like, oh my God, look at that. It's not an American chestnut understock. It's a Chinese. So there's always the exception to the rule.
Yeah, I think that tree is the state champion American chestnut for Connecticut.
Yeah, I did an article on it a couple of years ago that was in, the American Chestnut Foundation. That's Flippo Gravitt and the original tree, one of them. There's a picture of the one at the Lockwood Farm.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, this is the one at Lockwood Farm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Sally Jaynes holding yardstick. Just a note here from the studio. After a little bit of research and some help from Dr. Sandy, it turns out that the tree that we're talking about here, the Scientist Cliffs tree, is not actually the American chestnut champion for the state of Connecticut. That's a different tree that is nearby, planted in the American chestnut survivor orchard at Lockwood Farm. Anyway, back to the episode. And I've seen in the publications and on Dr. Sandy's website quite a bit of mention of Scientist Cliffs. So now I'm glad to know exactly what it is.
I'm not sure, I have no idea why. She thinks it might be a hybrid with European. And I'm like, no, you didn't see these trees growing in the woods, tall like you expect an American chestnut to be. And anyway.
Okay, so grafted versus planted seedlings.
I spent a lot of time, other people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you're going to vegetatively propagate some of these nice chestnut selections, whether it's Eton or something else. And apparently there's just no easy way yet. I mean, once in a while somebody can root some softwood cuttings, grafting, as we've already discussed, has pluses and minuses. But, if you're going to plant one or two trees in your yard,
you want the good tree.
Yeah, I mean, a seedling may or may not look like the parent, especially if it was a seed that came from the Sleeping Giant chestnut plantation where you got so many different things going on there. If it came from a commercial Chinese chestnut planting for nut trees, better chance you're going to get a pure Chinese. And if that grower has selected for big nuts, then you're going to get mostly seedlings with good-sized nuts.
Somewhere in one of these publications that you made so many years ago, I read that you noted that if you get the seedling of the tree and then graft that budwood to the seedling, you have the best.
Yeah, I think I learned about this technique, I think it was in a Korean forestry publication. You take a nut that's gone through dormancy and you let it germinate, and you cut off maybe 1/4 of an inch with the hypocotyl. You cut that off. And that gets you down to what are basically the leaves of the emerging seedling, the leaf stems going into the cotyledons, the 2 seed leaves. And you make a slice through those petioles, and you wedge shape a dormant scion into there, and then put this in a moist chamber or just in a container with a mix and keep it humid. And it can heal and grow into, it's a way to propagate. And you don't even have to grow a seedling. All you need is some nuts.
So when you did that, was it the exact same nut of the tree, or was it just any nut in the same species?
A little bit of both, probably.
Gotcha.
Yeah. If you want to propagate sleeping giant, it might be good to have sleeping giant nuts. Mm-hmm. Sure.
When I first saw this diagram, when I read this chapter, I was in bed and I just started giggling so much because it's so crazy to think that you can do this and it works.
It's crazy but simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so was this something that you did a lot, or?
I did a few publications on it, and then we quit doing it. So nobody else has picked it up either, as far as I know. Clearly some problems.
Well, maybe it's worth some further experimentation on my part this coming harvest season.
From that part of my brain is not functioning for remembering details of over 40 years ago.
Thank you for talking about that, because I was totally blown away when I saw this. Yeah. What do you think of the future of hybrid chestnuts in New England? There's people planting chestnut orchards all over the place for nuts. For timber production, that doesn't seem to be an interest for the people who in my world of nut nerdery these days. And some people seem to think that chestnut trees are sort of a climate smart transition for regenerative agriculture, because chestnuts, the makeup of a chestnut is similar to corn, and corn has this negative impact on the natural ecology and on the landscape through tillage and through monoculture. So a lot of people have sort of pushed the idea that chestnut orchards could be not necessarily maybe a full replacement of corn, but it could at least take some of our diet and replace some of the carbohydrates and the things that we need at scale.
Yep.
But as you note in the last page of your chapter in this book, where you talk about the limitations to chestnut culture, there still are some problems. One of the big things is marketing. If we just talk about that a little bit, like what do you think the future is for the chestnuts?
Yeah, I mean, presumably, if you've got a good nut that's grown here, why wouldn't the local grocery store be happy to get that instead of importing the European chestnut? And, from my point of view, they have some flavor and peeling advantages. May not be quite as big as some of the large marron chestnuts, but still. Yeah, I still think it's an uphill battle. I mean, I'm trying to picture in New England having the kind of landscape where you could put even an acre of Chinese chestnut seedlings and not have the squirrels come in. Out in Ohio, I can picture it better. They've got cornfields and they don't have all the trees where the squirrels are hanging out within a couple 100 yards, and they're willing to walk that distance to get to a good food source.
And I mean, at the Sleeping Giant plantation, the biggest thing that comes by and eats the nuts is deer, because there isn't fencing to prevent the deer. And so there's people who set up and hunt the deer. But if you get there early enough, and you have to compete with the weevils, and there's a lot of things. But some years there's a lot of weevils, and some years there's not a lot of weevils. And it's kind of like, why is that? Not a lot of people have done studies on that I'm aware of. But I'm still able to get there and get a decent amount of nuts, despite the weevils and despite despite the deer and turkeys and whatever else. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and to have them, scattered in small parks, rather than, quote, picturing a commercial orchard, but just trees that, if the nuts are there and haven't already been taken by the wildlife, or you get there in time to knock a few off the branches and can rescue the nuts that way. Sure. I mean, it may not have the monetary value, but it may have satisfaction of going out and collecting some nuts and bringing them home and eating them.
Stuffing a turkey or whatever.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
There's a nut orchard in Sunderland, Massachusetts, near where I go to school, called Big River Chestnuts, right on the Connecticut River.
Oh, wow.
And you should go there. They have sort of a potluck thing. Huh. And I went to one 2 years ago where, people were making chestnut bread, and because it's gluten-free, there's lots of folks who are really interested in that side of it, the flour. And it's a sort of a gathering where many different folks from all walks of life come together and just celebrate chestnuts and all the products.
Yeah, if it's in the floodplain or so of the Connecticut River,
the soil.
It sounds like you could have some open space there, so maybe the squirrels wouldn't be quite so bad a problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. I'll have to ask
how they deal with that. Yeah. The problem with chestnut, from my point of view, and you must run into this over the sleeping giant, is that the odds are pretty high they're going to be infested with chestnut weevil.
Yeah.
And really need a biological control or something for the chestnut weevil, because that's a big downside. And if you get the nuts, as soon as they pop out of the shell and blanch them, you zap what could be a just hatched larva, and you'll never know it was there. But let them sit around for a while, and it's like, oh my goodness, look at all these maggot-like things. Yeah, it's discouraging.
Yeah, and some of my friends actually will climb the trees and knock down the burrs before they fall to avoid that.
Yes, and if you hold them for a week or two, I'd put them in a damp, cool garage, and they'll mature, and then with leather gloves, you can pop them open, or they begin to split. You can deal with them. Yeah.
Well, it's just incredible to see the amount of folks who go to the Arthur Graves research plot, and they probably have they're bringing their kids, and people show up with bike helmets on to avoid the nuts.
Oh yeah. If you get a burr falling from up high, it can really get you. I remember Arthur Graves, he was bald, and he normally wore a hat, but he was known on occasion to get a burr on the top of his head. Yeah.
That's funny. Could we take a moment to maybe just jump back into the cultivar topic for a second? I was hoping that we could take a moment, especially to talk about Little Giant.
Little Giant?
It's this little tree.
A Seguin hybrid?
I took a picture of it the other day, and on Dr. Sandy's website, it has the parentage, and she says, Richard A. Jaynes collected open-pollinated seed from West Lot R23T12 and planted 76 seedlings at Lockwood Farm on Humphrey Hill in 1971. One of the 1971 trees had a heavy crop of nuts. Jaynes planted the 12 seedlings from these in road 5, and then in 1977, a very small tree with large nuts and prolific production was later named Little Giant. And this Little Giant tree has become...
Yeah, I didn't name it. She must have.
Oh, maybe she...
I think. Okay, that's got to be a Seguin Chinese offspring, and through more than one generation. And actually, the original crosses were made by Hans Niensted, Danish guy who got his forestry degree at Yale. And when I worked a couple summers at the experiment station, he was there, and I made crosses and chestnuts for him and Dr. Graves. And I regretted that I didn't pursue those seedlings a little more, because you can get a small tree, hopefully with a good sized nut. But yeah, as you know, probably better than I do, there are a number of small or aspiring commercial orchards. And it's like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
It's, as you noted, all the problems with chestnut, but also some of that is also problems that you run into on other nut trees. Is, how to keep the squirrels away. Are there particular insects and diseases that bother them? And I mean, wildlife, squirrels, birds, chipmunks, filberts. You never harvest a filbert around here. It's sad. So commercially, you need big blocks of land that you don't have woods right up to it to help keep wildlife away. I mean, just one of the problems. And so a place like Connecticut, I mean, I had thought long and hard for years about, okay, is there a place for commercial nut trees in Connecticut, whether it's chestnut or something else? And we had some very active, energetic nut growers, amateurs, but who would like to have done commercial things, in propagation and selling of trees. One guy named Messner, he did some of this. But long and the short of it is, I mean, almost the best you could do is grow seedlings and sell seedlings. If you're only going to have a couple of trees in your yard, you really would like a clone. You want Eaton or Sleeping Giant or Little Giant and go from there. So I'm always a little frustrated. And I was thinking about Arthur Graves. He was an eternal optimist, and every cross, that was going to solve the problem of getting back the American chestnut. He was just so positive. And I've always thought, I had a more realistic view of some of the limitations. Especially at the experiment station, a breeding program on chestnuts. I mean, you got to be able to grow not hundreds, but thousands of trees and grow them for more than just a year or two. It's not like even tomatoes, which are an annual crop, or corn. If you go to Hawaii in the winter, you can grow 2 crops, or wheat, you can grow 1 million plants on an acre or something. But it's a tough thing with chestnut. So I'm kind of delighted after almost 100 years of different people breeding chestnuts that they've taken a wheat gene and introduced it into the American chestnut. So it's 99+% pure American chestnut. And, they're going through I think they're pretty well along now in being able to release it. It's taken them years and years. But I'm like, oh, wow. Because, Graves spent a lifetime. Nienstedt spent years there. Sandy spent a lot of time. Yeah, I spent a lot of time making crosses. And the American Chestnut Foundation, bless their heart, they've gotten tremendous support and done a lot of breeding based on Burnham's work. He worked with grains, but he thought he could transfer that knowledge to chestnut. I have never been very confident that back crossing to American chestnut, you would get a blight-resistant tree, but he was introducing that work at the time I was leaving the experiment station, so I've, been very reluctant to voice my concerns because it's like, hey, okay. But the American Chestnut Foundation, incredible the amount of resources they've been able to get. I mean, they've got a tremendous staff, and it's all on what we would call soft money. Yeah. We never felt we had enough money at the experiment station, but it was, in a sense, hard money. I mean, it was in the annual budget.
So we've talked quite a bit about chestnut trees, which makes sense, as it was your research area. But I know that you have an interest in other nut trees as well, having been part of the Northern Nut Growers Association. And even where we're sitting, I mean, we're surrounded by a variety of very interesting tree crops in this landscape here at Broken Arrow Nursery. Are there any other nut trees or just fruit trees you wanted to talk about?
at least one other nut tree that's here in the yard, a pecan that I got from Earl Cully, who is quite a nurseryman out in Illinois. He introduced heritage river birch among other commercial trees. Anyway, before we actually built this house moved in 1965, but a couple of years before that, he sent me some nut trees. That's a hybrid hickory over there. But he sent me a major pecan, which is hardy northern pecan, right? Well, if you're in the Midwest. It grew up, and I don't know how old it was, 10, 12 years, and had nuts, but they wouldn't fill. It's not hot enough. We don't get enough BTUs during the summer, especially evenings. And that may change, but so I grafted it back to a shagbark hickory, Glover variety, which, interestingly, the nuts, if you put them on an anvil and tap them with a hammer, they'll crack open and you get two halves. They're as easy to crack open as a pecan, if not easier. But I got to tell you, the squirrels get them mostly. Every 2 or 3 years we get a decent crop, but we don't get very many nuts.
I have a pig nut hickory that seeded itself in the front of the house, and I'm hoping to get some scion of Granger shagbark hickory and top graft it, because Granger produces a massive nut. And with the Carpathian walnuts that are planted behind the house, I haven't eaten a single one. So, but I will say the heart nuts that are planted at Lockwood, it doesn't seem like they get totally knocked out by squirrels. I don't know maybe because the landscape is more open there.
Yeah, it's right along Evergreen Ave outside the fence there. Yeah. Right. I'll admit, years ago, getting a few nuts from almost every tree in that collection. There are fewer trees now than there used to be. Yeah. They've been there forever. They haven't grown particularly fast. Not much soil, I think. Yeah.
But the landscape there, there is woods in some places, but there's just maybe enough predation from hawks and other things that the things are kept. And also there's a fence, so there's no deer. Any other things that you loved? You worked with more. Chestnuts, it seemed like, was the focus of a lot of your research, but I know that you had.
Well, the Kalmia, the mountain laurel. Kalmia and its relatives. This was a genus, the native mountain laurels, and the other species. Those species don't cross particularly well with each other, but in trying to make the interspecific crosses among the species, I began to learn how much variation there was in a native mountain laurel that nobody had appreciated. And so I spent a lot of time making crosses among some of these things. There are little-leafed laurels, there's willow-leafed laurels, all different flower colors and patterns in the flowers. And as I say, compared to working with chestnut, it was relatively easy crop to work with. And the book that I did on it, pretty well received, and in a sense summarizes all the work I did at the experiment station, hopefully in terms that people could understand.
I'm sure. Yeah. I find this book very readable, the Nut Tree Culture in North America.
You had asked to say something about the experiment station. Yeah, they serve a lot of different interest groups in the state. And I can't even name you all. They got chemistry, biochemistry departments. They do a lot of analyses of foods, minerals, and vitamins, etc. Entomology, they're doing a lot of work. What's now on the front pages are, of course, work with ticks and tick diseases. Plant pathology, they deal with a range of things there. Yeah, as I started there, it was a genetics department, but it ultimately became a forestry department. They're the oldest experiment station in the country. They predate the land-grant university. So they split their funds with UConn, and unlike every other experiment station that's administered through the university, actually the experiment station is through the governor's office. Yeah. So they're quite independent of the university.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a great place to work, but after I realized I was vested, I had 25 years experience. I wasn't old enough to collect retirement. Had the Christmas trees going and decided to start a nursery.
Yeah.
And I'd always admired all the different plants that Western Nurseries had up there. In fact, I used to go up every year and walk through their fields of mountain laurel looking for unique color forms, pinks and red budded. And anyway, I said, oh man, I should have worked up here a couple summers to learn all the different plants that they had. Well, there were changes in the family, different generations, and they had to sell a lot of their land. So they still have a great garden center, but they don't grow the diversity of plants that they used to. But anyway, I think that's where I got some of the inspiration of growing unusual trees and shrubs, propagating them, and doing a lot of grafting and rooting of cuttings to grow these unusual plants. The one thing you don't want to do in a nursery like ours, you can't compete with the box stores and the huge growers, with hundreds or 1,000 acres of plants. So by growing unusual plants seems to be, we've got a good market. Things have gone well.
Yeah, no, I think that the selection of stuff that you have here is pretty remarkable. I've purchased sunflower pawpaw from here. I got a Cassandra vine from here, which is the 5-flavored vine from China.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that this is one of the most premier. Also, you have persimmon varieties. Have you had the Have you ever?
We've got a John Rick, a big tree right out here, and it's a dioecious. It needs a male or pollen, which we don't have for it. So the persimmons are a little bit smaller than typical if they had seeds in them, but they don't have seeds in them, which is kind of great.
Yeah, that is great.
Yeah.
So it's like a parthenocarpic fruit then.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool.
Exactly. We do have some pawpaws around, sunflower, and we have some of Neil Peterson's selections, which are great. One of them, the graft died, but I think he grafts them on seedling understocks that are from the selected trees. So the understock is almost as good as the name cultivar.
That's fantastic.
Which is great, instead of some little tiny witsy thing.
And so do you eat the pawpaws and the persimmons every year?
It's amazing how few people are interested in the persimmon. But the pawpaws, Sally and I love it on salad. You just cut them up and like avocado.
That's interesting. I've never thought to have pawpaw on salad before.
Oh, you'll love it. I mean, it works fine. Yeah.
The persimmons are my favorite fruit, so I'm surprised to hear that.
I like them, but my wife, nah. She made persimmon bread, which is fine, but like most of those things, there are a number of different ways you can use them. But
if people want any trees from Broken Arrow Nursery, they can check out brokenarrownursery.com.
Yes, yeah. Most of our plant list is on there, or they can call and see if we have something or can get it. Yep. The pawpaws and persimmons they're really difficult to propagate, and they're very expensive and difficult to get from other growers. Frightfully expensive.
If anyone wants to reach you directly, do you want to say anything about like if there's somebody who really wants to write you a letter or something like that? Or I guess they can
contact me through the nursery. It's probably the easiest way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dick, for this interview. It has been absolutely fantastic. I'm sure that our listeners learned quite a bit about hybrid chestnuts and all the other topics that we covered today. Listeners, if you stuck around this long, thanks for sticking with us, and we'll see you next time.